Please be aware that because this is such a very long chapter, it has been split into two parts, Part 1 and Part 2. Chapter 3, Section 1, Part 1. Our personal adult ego behavioural patterns. As mentioned in the previous chapter, from the very first day that we are all first born, all humans are motivated by one emotion only, love. Whether this was more love given or more love taken away throughout all of our different childhood emotional events. This is why love is the most powerful emotion of all human emotions and can motivate us and drive us to do the most extraordinary feats of kindness and heroism. But lack of love, love taken away, can also destroy us internally. Because throughout our childhood and into adulthood, our long-term memories continues to recall all of our different childhood ego, fear or hurt emotions whenever we are upset, angry, in fear, hurt, stressed, or having any other different ego emotional wounds or suffering. This is the reason that the more difficult, unknown childhood emotional events that a person experienced through more love taken away, the more extreme a person will develop these ego, fear or hurt emotions into his or her extreme adult ego behavioural patterns. This is why we have all developed very different adult ego behavioural patterns, and in all different degrees of strength. Some of us have developed very mild adult ego behavioural patterns, and some more dominant, and some extreme adult ego behavioural patterns that have taken over control in the long-term memory, as you will discover through a few examples throughout this very long chapter. And this is how all of our different childhood ego, fear or hurt emotions begin to influence the direction of our lives for the rest of our lives. For instance, both of my parents were born in a very big city in England just before the Second World War, when poverty was quite common. My grandfather on my mother's side, however, became one of the silent heroes of the Second World War. He managed the main city's gasworks that ran all of the gas for lighting and heating all of the population of the city. However, unfortunately, most of the staff that were employed at the gasworks had to either leave their jobs to fight the war, or they were too frightened to help at the gasworks because of the chance of the gasworks being bombed. Because bombing the gasworks would mean the chance of instant death. And so my grandfather was left with only one other member of staff to help him in this very difficult job throughout the war. One day, one of the main very large gas pipes leading to the main gas tanks sprang a leak. And to stop this very big gas pipe from leaking, my grandfather and his helper, who also became a silent hero of the war, both had to fight really hard to get this very large gas pipe leak under control. And unfortunately, my grandfather breathed so many gas fumes that he became permanently sick, and then spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair and in a great deal of pain with severe rheumatoid arthritis. He died a very young man, in his mid-40s, that left my grandmother and a widow, and alone for the rest of her life. When the war broke out, my mother was 5 years old, and because she was a very young child, she had to be evacuated away from the city together with her sister. The same happened with my father and millions of other young children who also lived in these very big towns and cities, and all taken away from their parents at a very young, vulnerable and very emotionally sensitive age, to live in homes with total strangers for many years until the war ended. This must have been the most frightening experiences, but for most of these young children, they simply would not have understood what was happening to them, because they were far too young to rationally and logically think for themselves. That is why most of these very young children would have simply assumed that they had been abandoned by their parents. And these emotional feelings of abandonment would have developed a great deal of different, unknown, involuntary, very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions to become dominantly stored into their long-term memories. And the main cause of many different, difficult, ego-emotional wounds and suffering to begin developing into these innocent, sensitive, and very young, very malleable long-term memories that most of these children would not have become aware of. Many of these young evacuated children were taken to live in rural countries, areas, to live for many years with foster parents on farms or in small villages away from any serious war conflicts or bombings. Imagine if we had been taken away from our parents at that age of 2 to 5 years old to live with complete strangers that we had never met before. Because we mustn't forget that no young child are able to logically and rationally work out what is happening to them. Their young child's brains simply functions through emotions and feelings. This is why these very young evacuated children would simply assume that they would have been abandoned. Imagine how these very young children involuntarily and unknowingly began to develop all of these different illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions through all of these emotions of abandonment and all other emotional insecurities and vulnerabilities that all very young children have, that would have become permanently stored into these young evacuated child's long-term memories. And whatever illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that were stored into these child's long-term memories throughout all of these emotional events, living with complete strangers for many years, and all of the wondering what had happened to their own parents throughout all of this long wartime period, would have then become dominantly stored as the bedrock and foundation of all stored emotional information in these evacuated children's long-term memories. Of course, some might have been good emotional events, but we can only imagine that for most young children, these emotional events must have been extremely fearful and very frightening, because we mustn't forget that whatever emotional information is stored into any child's long-term memory becomes the bedrock and foundation of that child's emotional information for the rest of his or her life, because our long-term memory is the main memory storage organ in our brain, and we are only able to recall information that has previously been stored into our long-term memories, as you will discover shortly. This is why our very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions becomes the bedrock and foundation for all of our future behavioural patterns, because our long-term memories controls all of our behavioural patterns, all our thought patterns, all of our decisions, all of our reasoning, and even most of our reactions. And this has been the same case for all of our ancestors throughout all of our past human history. And this is the same case even in our modern world today. As mentioned earlier, throughout the Second World War, it was far too dangerous for my mother and her sister to stay in the house, that belonged to my grandfather's job, because my grandfather had to live on the site in a house that belonged to the gasworks. And so at the age of 5 years old, my mother and her sister went to live in some remote farm in the countryside, miles from her paternal home and miles away from her own mother and father. And as a very young 5-year-old child, my mother didn't understand what was going on. She didn't understand that she had been evacuated because of the war. She simply assumed, as all children would assume at 5 years old, that she had been abandoned. And so to counteract these emotions of abandonment, she spent the rest of her life elevating her own attention and her own sense of self-importance, inept at building and nurturing emotional bonds. And because my mother developed all of these different extreme ego emotions since her very early childhood, this had a knock-on effect for my own stored illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that became stored in my own long-term memory, because I was not aware that throughout many of my very early childhood emotional events, I was involuntarily and unknowingly triggering and developing many different illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions to become dominantly stored into my own long-term memory through lack of love, love taken away. This is why we are all no different from each other, because we are all unaware of the influences that our own individual and different very early childhood emotional events have on the emotional information that becomes stored into our long-term memories, that will have a lifelong effect on the direction of our lives for the rest of our lives. My father was also evacuated in the Second World War, but once the war ended, my father, who was now a young teenager, returned home to the city slums where poverty was rife. But his mother wasn't able to find the money to look after him, and so as a young boy he had to go out to work to find the money to survive. My father grew up in poverty, so much so that one day he vowed that he would get out of this poverty and out of the city slums and never return to experience these money difficulties ever again. And although my father was a very kind, loving and happy man, these early childhood emotional experiences had already begun to develop his very early childhood illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions to become stored more dominantly into his long-term memory. And this is the reason that, when I was a very young child, he was always busy, always striving to do better, and to always have enough money for a good home to support us 4 children. This meant that his own set of adult ego behavioural patterns would often become dominant and often rise to the surface, and on many occasions he would become angry and short-tempered with us children. Because of his frustration, always having to work hard to make money and to do better. And so, most of his life, he took on 2 jobs, his main full-time professional employment and his second job. He would come home from work, get changed, have his dinner and go back to work, renovating and restoring a very old property that he had invested a small amount of money in, so that he could try to one day sell the property for a small profit, and he did this with no help from any builders or any other tradesmen. This is how renovating properties became my father's second income for many years. And this is the reason that 80% of our ancestors and 80% of us today still continue to struggle to survive as humans. But unfortunately, this is how most of us continue to develop many of our different adult ego fears through our struggles to find money to survive. And this has been the same case throughout many thousands of years. This is the reason that money is at the root of all evil, because money feeds, drives, develops, and therefore controls and increases many of our different, unknown, ego, fear or hurt emotions to become stored and take over control in our long-term memory. And this is the reason that we still have many similar generational ego fears as our ancestors, such as all of these ego money fears, ego health fears, ego war fears, increases in food, heating and fuel ego fears, and many other similar generational ego fears and suffering. This is the reason that throughout this chapter we will be discussing a few of our past ancestors' generational ego fears and how they developed, and also some of our more modern ego fears that are developed through many modern technologies that are now rapidly increasing our ego fears today. For example, all sorts of internet scams, email scams, social media scams, banking scams, telephone and mobile scams, phishing and computer hacking, and many different scams that are now beginning to appear in our modern world today, because overpopulation is creating desperate people to now think up desperate methods to use all of these different extreme ego behaviours to trick and manipulate money out of others more vulnerable and less developed with extreme ego behavioural patterns. And this also is why you, your brothers, your sisters, your children, your parents, your grandparents, and all of your relatives and family members, friends, work colleagues, and all of your ancestors, and all the people that you will meet throughout your life, will have also accumulated in all different degrees of strength, all of their own different illogical, irrational ego, fear or hurt emotions. And throughout our adult lives, and even into old age, whenever we become upset, angry, fearful, hurt, stressed, anxious, distrusting, through many different difficult face-to-face ego interactions, ego conflicts, ego anger and arguments, ego heated and awkward discussions, even difficult ego situations and ego events, through stress with money, loss of money, relationship loss, loss of health, difficult shopping interactions, difficult banking interactions, difficult travel interactions, or different difficult fear-based interactions on all kinds of digital technologies, etc. Our ego emotions rise to the surface and take over control in our long-term memories. And then we react with more of these similar ego emotions and behaviours. This is how our very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions begin to develop into our own set of individual and different adult ego behavioural patterns. Because, as mentioned earlier, our long-term memories is the largest storage memory organ in our brain, and we have no idea the enormous capacity of information that we are all able to store in our long-term memories. And this is why, in adulthood, whenever we are upset, angry, hurt, fearful, anxious, stressed, distressful, or having any other kind of ego emotional wounds and suffering, our ego emotions take over control in our long-term memories and reacts. And unfortunately, with the help of neuroplasticity, this is how we all continue to increase these ego emotions throughout our lives to become stored into our long-term memories. Because, as you are about to discover shortly, our ego emotions can sometimes even prevent us from getting to sleep at night. This is why we should never ever underestimate the power, control and strength of our own set of different ego emotions. Because this is how all of our different childhood ego, fear or hurt emotions become the bedrock and foundation for all of our personal and individual information. In other words, the self, the personal I am, because our long-term memories doesn't store genetic information. It's simply storing all of our personal information right back since our very early childhood, and continues to do so throughout all of our entire lives. This is why, for many of us, we spend most of our lives reflecting on ourselves and thinking and worrying about ourselves. This is the ego side of our human nature and our ego emotions that can rise to the surface of our long-term memories whenever we are having heated conflicts, difficult arguments, disagreements with difficult people, or even whenever we are interacting with fear-based TV media news, fear-based social media, fear-based movies, fear-based computer games, fear-based smartphone communication, fear-based scams, surveillance, lack of money, paying bills, fear-based legalities and authorities, fear-based taxes, fear-based health issues, fear-based travel, fear-based interactions through shopping, banking, reading fear-based books, media in newspapers, media on the radio, even ego, fear or hurt emotional interactions through relationships, through work colleagues, family favoritism, family indoctrinations, family rivalries, and for many other different reasons. The list is endless. I personally and deliberately don't follow any kind of political, religious, financial, economic, social, cultural, or have any other strong beliefs or ideologies. And I don't watch fear-based TV media news, fear-based social media, play any kind of fear-based computer games, watch fear-based movies, or read fear-based books. And I try really hard to stop and walk away from any interactions with individuals that are behaving with extreme ego behavioural patterns, unless, of course, I have no choice. I deliberately do this because I don't want any of my own personal ego emotions to become triggered and activated. In other words, I try to avoid my own set of ego behavioural patterns from rising to the surface and getting upset, angry, in fear, hurt, stressed, anxious, or triggering any other of my different ego emotional wounds and suffering from taking over control in my long-term memory. A small example of our ego emotions taking over control in our long-term memories is when many of us give admiration, credence, and status to people who have acquired large amounts of money or own expensive cars or lavish expensive houses, etc. Because if a person has acquired monetary wealth, it makes us think that money has created these people to become lucky, happy and successful. And this makes some of us to become jealous of their success. But jealousy is one of our highly influential ego emotions rising to the surface of our long-term memories. However, many individuals who have obtained a great deal of monetary wealth are very unhappy and unknowingly emotionally suffering, because to have acquired large amounts of monetary wealth means that we need to focus all of our attention on fully developing strong ego greed and all different ego desires and ego temptations and all different ego ruthless behaviours in order to obtain such abundance of money. But the more ego emotions we develop, the more we are unknowingly emotionally suffering, because money is now feeding, driving, ruling and controlling, and therefore increasing even more ego emotions to take over control in our long-term memories. And the more our long-term memories become controlled by these ego emotions, the more we begin to suppress our advanced, highly evolved, altruistic emotions. But this doesn't become apparent until one day a drastic event happens and our ego emotions rise to the surface in our long-term memories, and we start to get upset, angry, hurt, in fear, stressed, or have any other ego emotional wounds or suffering. This is when these ego emotions have taken over control of all rational and logical information stored in our long-term memories. And in extreme circumstances, this can even cause such ego emotional suffering as deep depression or any other different ego emotional mental health sickness. This is the reason that, in the second half of this book, you are about to discover the solutions for true and complete peace and happiness that cannot be obtained through monetary wealth, but through spiritual wealth, because spiritual wealth is the highest level of existence that any one person can reach in any one person's lifetime, because this requires us to remain present only in our highly evolved altruistic emotions, whereas monetary wealth requires us to remain present only in our ego emotions. This is the reason that our ego emotions are the not so welcome side of our human nature, because focusing all of our attention on ego greed to obtain money is connected to the I am, the self, the ego side of our human nature, when we begin to focus all of our ego thoughts on our own self-importance. And this is when our highly evolved altruistic emotions of generosity of our human spirit, loving kindness and compassion for others begins to take a back seat. And sometimes, when some of us don't succeed in obtaining monetary wealth, this can then even cause us to develop even more ego emotions through ego emotional stress, ego fears, ego anxieties, and sometimes even, in extreme circumstances, if we are very unfortunate and we lose all of our monetary wealth, some of us can even become so sick with ego worry and ego stress that these ego emotions have now taken over control in the long-term memory. And this is why financial fear and stress is one of the worst forms of stress that we can acquire, because sometimes, in extreme circumstances, it can even create all different kinds of physical illness and sickness. This is the reason that money is at the root of all evil, because money feeds, drives, rules, controls, and increases all of our different ego emotional wounds and suffering. But many of us tend to base our friendships around monetary status and the amount of money a person has obtained. And if we find that a person is in poverty, we very quickly shut down our affections. However, some of the most happiest, most generous and kind people on our planet today have absolutely no monetary wealth and prefer to spend their entire lives giving to others through their highly evolved altruistic emotions and through the emotions of compassion, loving kindness and generosity of their human spirit towards others, even total strangers that they occasionally meet throughout their lives. And this is a very rare gift to achieve, because I know a few of these enlightened individuals and have personally witnessed this generosity many times myself, and still can continue to do so, because many underprivileged people that are living a placid and peaceful life, living off the land and growing their own foods in basic small village rural communities, are mostly self-sufficient and don't need lavish and expensive houses and cars. Therefore, they are not controlled by these strong ego-driven desires to obtain as much money as they can. Instead, they are happy and content with what little material possessions they have. And as long as they have enough good food, warmth, comfort, their mild ego emotions are not always striving to acquire material possessions. And this is why they remain happy, because their altruistic emotions are able to give gladly and generously whatever small possessions they own, such as small bags of fruit or vegetables, a cup of coffee, etc. But remember that this, for them, is all they own, all of their possessions. Therefore, these extreme gestures of kindness and generosity are enormous gestures and can only be achieved through acquiring dominance in the long-term memory with these altruistic emotional behavioural patterns of the collective consciousness. Because along with many incredible attributes that are associated with altruism, they also allow us to develop higher states of wellness and healing within ourselves. And this is how these enlightened individuals begin to feel much more healthy and happy, because our mental health is sometimes connected and associated with many of our physical health issues. However, please be aware that I am not a medical doctor, and therefore you will need to continue to seek medical help if you are suffering from any mental or physical health issues. As mentioned already, I personally don't follow any kind of religious beliefs for reasons that I explained earlier. However, we can all find a very good example of how many of our ancestors developed many different extreme ego behavioural patterns through a very well-known story that is still recited even throughout most of our modern world today, that occurred more than 2,000 years ago. And like myself, even if you don't follow any kind of religious beliefs, nearly all people know the story of Jesus Christ that was sentenced to death by Roman leaders and dragged through the streets, having to carry his own cross on his back for his own crucifixion. And on arrival, he was nailed to his own cross as a method of punishment and left to hang on this large wooden beam for several days until he died from extreme pain, suffering and exhaustion. This was one of the most cruel and sadistic methods of punishment caused by some of our ancestors. However, the reason why I am repeating this story is that while Jesus was in this great deal of physical, mental and emotional pain and suffering, he happened to speak one very important and very simple message to all of us, the same message that Christians still repeat even in our modern world today. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. At that time, more than 2,000 years ago, Jesus was not able to scientifically explain the reasons why he spoke these words. However, he was fully aware of the Roman leaders' extreme ego behavioural patterns that had now become so extreme, in fact, that they had fully taken over control in their long-term memories, and were now so extreme and so out of control of all logical and rational information stored in their long-term memories that they had become a sickness in the long-term memory. And this is how they were able to trigger and activate some of mankind's more serious and extreme, aggressive and violent ancient ancestors' more primitive genetic emotions that are stored in another area in our human brain, our genetic memory. And this is how, throughout mankind's history, some of these more serious and extreme ego behavioural patterns have also become the very same catalyst and instigator that has caused all of these thousands of different conflicts, wars, fighting, killing, destruction, and all of the suffering and separation that we have experienced with each other throughout thousands of years of our human history. And that is why we are going to discuss some of our genetic emotions in the next few chapters, and the reasons for the differences in these genetic emotions between both genders. Because we have all developed these genetic emotions, including myself. However, it is very important to recognise that it is only some of these extreme ego behavioural patterns that have become so out of control of all logical and rational information stored in our long-term memories that have the capacity to trigger and activate some of these ancient ancestors' primitive genetic emotions. This is why, if we don't have the courage to face our own human behaviours, we will all be stuck in the same patterns and cycles of behaviours as our ancestors, with a similar inevitable emotional cycle and outcome of suffering as our ancestors. Loss of money is one of the main reasons that will accumulate some of our more serious ego emotions, because loss of money usually happens very suddenly, and because most of us have not yet learned alternative ways to live and survive together with each other than relying entirely on money for our own individual and close family survival. When a crisis arises and we are left without financial support, all of our different ego emotional wounds and suffering begin to rise to the surface of our long-term memories. All the different ego fears, ego stress, ego anxieties, ego distrust, ego hurt, ego humiliation, and many other different ego emotions become activated, and this is how we begin to accumulate and increase even more ego emotions to become stored into our long-term memories. And this is happening to a large percentage of us today, because a large percentage of us are not wealthy and don't have enormous amounts of financial savings to keep us all safe and secure. And with huge increases in overpopulation, with nearly 8 billion people now living on our fragile planet Earth, we are all relying entirely on money for our own individual and close family survival. This is why we are all now slaves to money, because we are all now spend our lives chasing money. And this is why money is now ruling, controlling, and driving all of our different ego emotions. Money is also the reason that throughout my own life I have witnessed a great deal of exploitation of the more vulnerable and underprivileged people, simply because these people were taken advantage of by some extreme ego-driven individuals whose main concern was ego greed for monetary power and control, with no other concerns other than simply making financial profits. And this is the reason that all exploitation, all oppression, all suppression, and all suffering of all the more vulnerable and underprivileged people still continues to increase throughout our modern world today, simply because there are almost 8 billion people living on our fragile planet, and some vulnerable and underprivileged people even have to leave their homes and countries in search of money for their own individual and close family survival. This is when many underprivileged and vulnerable people will go through extreme hardships and suffering to find money for their own individual and close family survival. This is why we are all now slaves to money, and why money is at the root of all evil, because our need to rely entirely on money for our own human survival is also the instigator of all of our different ego fears with each other, all ego distrust of each other, and all separation with each other. And this has been the same case throughout mankind's history for thousands of years. But money is not the only reason that causes us to increase our different ego emotions, as we have already mentioned so far throughout this chapter, and will continue to do so throughout the rest of this chapter, because there are thousands of different reasons that we develop our different ego emotions. One instance is how some of us develop many of our ego hurt emotions. For example, we have all heard of such phrases as the blue-eyed boy, or fathers favouring their daughters, or mothers favouring their sons, or even mothers favouring the last of the boys born in the family. So why does this generally happen? When a very young child is given overindulgence of attention and affection throughout childhood, a young child is still unknowingly and involuntarily storing ego emotions as dominant emotions into his or her long-term memories. But these ego emotions can develop and give a child a false sense of emotional security. And when that child becomes an adult, he or she will begin to display overinflated ego behavioural patterns, such as overinflated ego confidence or overinflated self-worth. In other words, overly concerned with one's own self-importance, desires, needs or interests. In other words, the self, the ego, the I am side of our personalities that has taken over control in the long-term memory. You will find a few examples of the lives of some historical figures that received too much attention and affection throughout childhood in the index, so that you can begin to research and recognize these different behaviors. On the other hand, involuntary and unknown ego emotions developed through more love taken away can become the most destructive ego emotions to develop in a child's long-term memory. And this is the reason that throughout this chapter we are going to give a few examples of a few of our ancestors throughout our human history that developed some extreme, illogical, irrational, ego fear or hurt emotions through too much love taken away throughout childhood. So extreme, in fact, that they took over control in the long-term memory to develop into some extreme adult ego behavioural patterns, as you will discover shortly. This is how too much love taken away in very early childhood can sometimes even lead to many different ego emotional hang-ups, or a lifetime of questioning and doubting ourselves, and sometimes even blaming ourselves and thinking that it is ourselves that have caused our lives to turn out so difficult. Because as mentioned earlier, the definition of a memory, any memory, is the power or process of recalling whatever has been previously learnt or experienced, bringing even further questioning and doubting, and sometimes will even begin to question and doubt some individual's own self-worth, and can initiate so many different ego emotions, such as lack of self-confidence, lack of self-worth, lack of self-love, lack of self-respect, and many other different ego emotions that develop in the long-term memory. Even some individuals will develop different ego emotions such as loneliness, depression, isolation, etc. And in extreme circumstances, extreme ego emotions can even develop into many different kinds of mental health issues, such as self-harm, deep depression, obsessions, addictions, temptations, sleep disturbance, narcissism, sadism, and all sorts of corruption or indoctrinations through many of our different religious, political, cultural, or social ideologies and beliefs, etc. Even extreme ego greed for money. These are very serious ego emotions indeed. This is why pure, balanced love, nurturing, affection, and attention given to a child and to ourselves is the most powerful gift that we can give. Because we mustn't forget that whatever is stored into our long-term memories since our early childhood is who we become. Because our long-term memories can only recall whatever has been previously stored into our long-term memories. So how do we know that it is this area in our brain, our long-term memories, that is the area that stores all of our personal, emotional information since our very early childhoods and throughout all of our lives? And how do we know that it is our very earliest childhood ego emotions that have the greatest influence on our long-term memories and therefore the greatest influence on most of our behavioural patterns? This following independent scientific research study is one of the most extremely valuable pieces of research evidence that neuroscience experts discovered in the 1950s and is still used even today as important evidence to explain the functioning of our different memories. Because this particular research allows us to understand how all of our human brains began to store all of our different, unknown and unwanted, very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions to become stored involuntarily by the way, into our long-term memories, and that we all continue to react with throughout our lives, and that unknowingly develop into our own set of different adult ego behavioural patterns. However, I am sure that by now there will be more recent independent scientific research studies available. Nonetheless, many neuroscience experts still relate to this particular study and have learnt a great deal about the functioning of our different memories through this following very specific operation that occurred in the 1950s. Humans retain different types of memories for different lengths of time. Short-term memories last seconds to hours, while long-term memories last for years. We also have a working memory, which lets us keep something in our minds for a limited time by repeating it. Whenever you say a phone number to yourself over and over to remember it, you're using your working memory. Another way to categorize memory is by the subject of the memory itself and whether you are consciously aware of it. Declarative memory, also called explicit memory, that consists of the sorts of memories you experience consciously. Some of these memories are facts or common knowledge, things like the capital of Portugal, Lisbon, or the number of cards in a standard playing cards deck, 52. Others consist of past events you've experienced, such as childhood birthday. Non-declarative memory, also called implicit memory, unconsciously builds up. These include procedural memories, which your body uses to remember the skills you've learnt. Do you play an instrument or ride a bicycle? Those are your procedural memories at work. Non-declarative memories also can shape your body's unthinking responses, like salivating at the sight of your favourite food or tensing up when you see something you fear. In general, declarative memories are easier to form than non-declarative memories. It takes less time to memorise a country's capital than it does to learn how to play the violin. But non-declarative memories stick around more easily. Once you've learned to ride a bicycle, you're not likely to forget. To understand how we remember things, it's incredibly helpful to study how we forget, which is why neuroscience experts studied amnesia, the loss of memories or the ability to learn. Amnesia is usually the result of some kind of trauma to the brain, such as a head injury, a stroke, a brain tumour, or chronic alcoholism. There are two main types of amnesia. The first, retrograde amnesia, occurs when you forget things that you knew before the brain trauma. Interrograde amnesia is when brain trauma curtails or stops someone's ability to form new memories. The most famous case study of interrograde amnesia is Henry Molaison, who in 1953 had parts of his brain removed as a last-ditch treatment for severe seizures. While Molaison, known when he was alive as HM, remembered much of his childhood, he was unable to form new declarative memories. People who worked with him for decades had to reintroduce themselves with every visit. By studying people as HM, scientists can trace where and how different kinds of memories form in the brain. It seems that short-term and long-term memories don't form in exactly the same way, nor do declarative and procedural memories. What we can clearly identify from these very important independent scientific research studies in the 1950s is that our oldest memories are our very early childhood emotions, and our oldest or earliest memories are still being recalled by our long-term memories, even into old age. And this is why we all continue to recall, develop and accumulate many of our different illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that we all are unaware of, but continue to get recalled throughout adulthood as our adult ego behavioural patterns, even into old age. This is the reason that we must all never ever underestimate the power, strength and control of all of our different ego emotions, because below you are now going to discover an extreme example of one individual throughout our human history that developed some extreme ego, fear or hurt emotions, so extreme in fact that they took over control in his long-term memory and began to activate some of mankind's more serious, aggressive and violent ancient ancestors' primitive genetic emotions that are found in another area in our brain, our genetic memory, and that we are going to discuss in the next few chapters. Genghis Khan, also spelled Chinggis, and whose original name was Temujin, was born in 1162 New Lake, Baikal in Mongolia. He died in August 1227. He was a Mongolian warrior and ruler and one of the most famous conquerors of all history, who consolidated tribes into a unified Mongolia and then extended his empire across Asia to the Adriatic Sea. The Mongol Empire became the largest empire in history, but only came into power by uniting many of the nomadic tribes of Northeast Asia. Genghis Khan, Temujin, was related on his father's side to Kabul Khan, Ambagai and Hatullah Khan, who headed the Kamag Mongol Confederation and were descendants of Bodonkar Mungag. And when the Churchen Jin dynasty switched support from the Mongols to the Tatars in 1161, they destroyed Kabul Khan. Genghis Khan's father was leader of the Kayat Borjan clan and nephew to Ambagai and Hatullah Khan, and so his father emerged as the head of the ruling Mongol clan, but was contested by a rival, a direct descendant of the Ambagai. When the Tatars grew too powerful after 1161, the Jin switched their support from the Tatars to the Karaites. Temujin grew up observing the tough political climate that included tribal warfare, thievery, raids, corruption and revenge between confederations that was compounded by other interferences such as China to the south. Temujin's early life was difficult. His father arranged a marriage for him and delivered him at the age of 9 years old to the family of his future wife Borte of the tribe Kongirad. Temujin lived and served the head of the household Taitsetsen until he was married at 12 years old. While heading home one night, his father ran into Tatars who had long been Mongol enemies. They offered him food that poisoned him, and learning this, Temujin returned to the family home to claim his father's position as chief. But the tribe refused him and cast out his family. Temujin then spent several years with his 3 brothers, sisters and half-brothers, and his mother surviving on wild fruits, wild ox carcasses, marmots and other game killed by Temujin and his brothers. Temujin's older half-brother, Begtar, began to exercise power as the eldest male in the family and would try to claim Hulan as his wife, who was not his own mother. But Temujin's resentment erupted during a hunting expedition when Temujin and his brother Kasar killed Bektar. Temujin's mother, Hulan, taught him many lessons, especially the need for strong alliances to ensure stability in Mongolia. In 1177, in a raid, Temujin was captured by his father's former allies, the Taitchatsun, who enslaved him with a kangai. Kangays are round portable wooden stocks with a hole in the middle to fit the head of the prisoner, so that the prisoner would have to live in stocks and carry the heavy wooden stocks around their necks. But one night, with the help of a guard, who was sympathetic to his suffering, Temujin escaped from his yurt, and the escape earned him the reputation that soon allowed him to join forces with Jalmay and Borju, and they, and the guard's son Chulwan, eventually became generals of Temujin's new army, or the name that he is now called today, Genghis Khan. And throughout all future fighting, the campaigns were often accompanied by large-scale massacres of civilian populations, especially in the Khwarezmian and Western Ksai controlled lands. And because of this brutality, this left millions dead, and this is why he is considered to be the most brutal ruler, because by the end of his life, the Mongol Empire occupied a substantial portion of Central Asia and China. If we consider the childhood life of Genghis Khan, it's not surprising that he developed such extreme, involuntary, very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego-fear or hurt emotions that became so extreme that they took over control in his long-term memory in adulthood, that permanently continued to activate his more serious, extreme, aggressive and violent genetic emotions stored in his genetic memory. Because throughout his early childhood, He had witnessed tribal warfare, thievery, raids, corruption and revenge between confederations. He had experienced the death of his father. He was married off by the age of 9 years old, and along with his own family, he was cast out of his own tribe to eventually find himself incarcerated and imprisoned to live a portion of his life carrying around his neck huge, heavy wooden stocks. It's not surprising that he began to develop extreme adult ego behavioural patterns that took over control in his long-term memory. This is why it's extremely sad that any of mankind's chances for a collective, positive and peaceful future with each other is being severely held back simply because we just don't know enough about our past and present human emotions. Because there are nearly 8 billion people now living on our vulnerable and fragile planet Earth. And each day, each person might experience their own individual and very different, difficult ego-emotional events for many different reasons. But the degree of strength that you react with your own set of adult ego-behavioural patterns whenever we are upset, angry, hurt, stressed, anxious, in fear, distrustful, or experiencing any other different ego-emotional wounds or suffering, identifies clearly the degree of strength of our own set of different, difficult, very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that have become involuntarily stored into our long-term memory that most of us were unaware of. This is because many of us don't even know or realise the extent of how our long-term memories have become influenced by many of our past, very early childhood emotional events. For instance, D.H. Lawrence, the famous author and poet that got into a lot of trouble because of some of his very suggestive books that were extremely provocative for this particular time in this year, in this period, 1900s. D.H. Lawrence, in an autobiography of Lawrence's life as a writer, confirms that his own set of very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt childhood emotions had been haunting him for his entire life. One day, Lawrence mentions to his wife Frida, the lifelong love of his life, that 42 years of writing books, he still couldn't lay his ghosts to rest. Lawrence was trying to explain to his wife that he was still haunted by his very early childhood emotional events that he received from his father because of too much love taken away, and that developed into his own set of unknown, involuntary, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions, and that continued to haunt him throughout most of his adult life. All of the questioning that affected his writing in many of his books, because his books became a means to try to gain emotional attention that he so desperately needed throughout his childhood, but never received from his father. As a young writer in his early years in 1910, he wrote his first book, and once completed, he printed and bound it and took it to show his father. Remember that in the early 1900s, to write and publish a book was a very difficult practice. He presented the book to his father, but his father asked him, "Why on earth did you spend all this time and wasted effort on writing a book?" His father wasn't impressed by all of this mental and emotional creative efforts, and didn't even bother to read his book. Lawrence was understandably devastated, very hurt by this emotional rejection from his father, because we mustn't forget that this emotional rejection, brought about through a great deal of love taken away, had already begun right back in his very early childhood years, that he wasn't even aware of, but began to involuntarily develop into some of his extreme, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions. Therefore, this new rejection from his father as an adult would have been another very serious destructive blow to his already well-established, very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that were already firmly and dominantly stored and established in his long-term memory. Because these new rejections would have continued to activate and develop into some extreme adult ego behavioural patterns that began to take over control in his long-term memory in adulthood. I am firmly convinced that this is the very reason that he spent most of his adult life writing books, in order to shock in a way that was a sort of cry for attention in the wilderness of his complete lack of love from his father. In other words, love denied, or too much love taken away throughout all of his very early childhood years. He simply couldn't understand why his father didn't feel the love for him that he so desperately needed as a very young child. And that is why love is the greatest gift that anyone can give to any child and to ourselves. In many different ways, we all go through our own personal and individual reasons that most of us cannot lay our own individual ghosts to rest, including myself. These are our own individual and personal very early childhood, involuntary, unknown, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that most of us were unaware of, but we can be sure that they will influence our lives for the rest of our lives. But many of our past ancestors, throughout millions of years, went through many extreme, difficult emotional events throughout very early childhood, because many of our past ancestors were emotionally unattached, unloved, and distant from their parental bonds and emotional conditioning that all children desperately need in order to grow up into stable, rational, and logical emotional adults. Because life, for many people throughout thousands of years of our past history, was extremely hard. Because poverty was much more common, and many fathers were forced to go out to work to support their families in some extremely hard and very difficult conditions, such as coal miners, fishermen, farming the lands before ploughs were invented. And for thousands of years, most men would have had to fight in all different kinds of conflicts, battles and wars, etc. And many would have been killed in battle, leaving wives and children homeless. And because of poverty, mothers were forced to go out to work to support the children and the family unit, or even, as we know, in more recent times, in the Second World War, most mothers had to work in the factories, farms and fields, while their husbands were out at war. And all young children had to be evacuated without seeing their parents for many years. And once the war was over, they were lucky if they saw both their parents alive again. This is why, throughout our human history, many young children were left without parental guidance, for many different reasons. Therefore, throughout our human history, all of these very important childhood emotions of love given, nurturing, loving kindness, compassion, affection, attention, security and protection, and even sometimes safety, were far less available for very young children. And in extreme circumstances throughout our human history, many young boys and many of our historical leaders were groomed, schooled and trained from a very early age, and some were even indoctrinated to be taught through these very early, very young and vulnerable childhood years to become great leaders or great soldiers. But unfortunately, this was taught to them mostly through love denied, lack of love, love taken away, lack of nurturing, and lack of attention and affection. And this is then how they transformed a few of our past historical leaders to become detached, cold, calculating, and ready in adulthood to use their now extreme and out of control ego behavioural patterns to be used to gain power and control over others through methods such as taking over control, ruling and conquering other countries, as we have already mentioned when we discussed the childhood life of Genghis Khan. And this is the reason that all past historical leaders throughout our human history all became highly influenced because of their very early childhood emotional events that influenced the direction of their lives for the rest of their lives. Because another very good example of this can be found in the childhood life of Adolf Hitler. This is why, to understand Hitler's strong desires to conquer and gain world power and control over others, we need to identify some of his early childhood emotional events. Adolf Hitler was born on 20th of April 1889 in Austria-Hungary, in present-day Austria. He was the fourth of 6 children born to Alois Hitler and his third wife, Clara Poltz. 3 of Hitler's siblings, Gustav, Ida, and Otto, died in infancy. And although Hitler was very young, he would have involuntarily picked up and stored into his very early childhood long-term memory many different extreme, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions, unknowingly triggered by his parents' grief. Living in the family house with Hitler was also his father's children from his second marriage, Alois Jr., born in 1882, and Angela, born in 1883. When Hitler was 3 years old, the family moved to Passau, Germany, and in 1894 the family returned to Haffeld near Lambach, Austria, when his father, Alois, farmed and kept bees. Also in 1894, Clara gave birth to their 5th child, Edmund, on 24th of March 1894. In 1895, 6-year-old Hitler attended a state-owned primary school. However, the move to Haffel coincided with intense father-son conflicts, caused by Hitler's refusal to conform to the strict discipline of his school. His father beat him, and his mother tried to protect him. And this is how many of these very early childhood extreme, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions began to develop through a great deal of his father's love taken away. His father, Alois' farming efforts failed, and in 1897 the family moved to Lambach. In 1898 the family returned to Leondig, but the move coincided with the death of his younger brother Edmund, who died in 1900 from measles. Hitler was distraught with his young brother's death, so much so that he changed to a morose, detached boy who constantly fought with his father and teachers. Hitler was, at that time, 11 years old, and he began to trigger some of his very early childhood extreme, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions to rise to the surface and take over control in his long-term memory, to become the permanent bedrock and foundation of all information stored in his long-term memory. This is why, once Hitler reached adulthood, he was unable to extend his emotions in any other direction except for extreme cold and calculating, illogical, irrational, adult ego behavioural patterns that had now fully taken over control in his long-term memory to become a sickness in his long-term memory. This is why we must now begin to learn by all of these past mistakes throughout our past human history, so that we never ever underestimate the power, control and strength of many of these extreme ego-driven behavioural patterns. Because if we can learn by some of our ancestors' past mistakes, we now have the opportunity to steer mankind in an opposite emotional direction and to avoid any further serious atrocities, destruction and suffering to ever happen throughout our world ever again. Because, along with all of these different conquering and invasions throughout our human history, millions of our ancestors also experienced millions of unnecessary deaths, and sometimes many who did survive continued throughout the rest of their lives to hold the ego-emotional scars, wounds and suffering, and even some experience physical scars. We must never forget this. This is why, in these next few chapters, we are going to spend some time to discuss some of our ancient ancestors' primitive genetic emotions that have been passed on and genetically given to us all through our genes, including myself, inherited from our ancestors throughout many thousands of years of these past very serious emotional events that our ancestors have experienced with each other. However, there are also a few individuals throughout our human history that developed the strength and determination but dominance of these adult ego behavioural patterns that, combined with their advanced, highly evolved altruistic emotions simply for the collective protection and greater good of humanity's survival, such as Presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt and Sir Winston Churchill, and many other leaders who worked together throughout the Second World War to defend and protect the world against Nazi invasion. But in order to understand, for example, how Sir Winston Churchill developed such extreme adult ego feral hurt emotional behavioural patterns, we need to first understand a little bit about his very early childhood emotional events. The story of Sir Winston Churchill's childhood, the Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1940 to 1945, who led Great Britain against Nazi Germany during the Second World War, is an example of one of our historical leaders who developed a combination of both very dominant, very early childhood, unknown, involuntary, extreme, illogical, irrational, ego-feral hurt emotions, and some of mankind's highly evolved emotions in order to become a well-loved war leader that defended and protected Britain, Europe and the world throughout the Second World War. But to understand how Winston developed some of his extreme and sometimes stubborn and arrogant ego behavioural patterns, we need to assess his very early childhood emotional events, because Winston had a very lonely early childhood upbringing. He was born into aristocracy in his family's ancestral home in Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire in England on the 30th of November 1874, at which time the United Kingdom was one of the most dominant leaders in world power through the reign of Queen Victoria. Winston was a direct descendant of the Duke of Marlborough, and his family were amongst the highest level of British aristocracy. And because of this reason, he was born and brought up amongst the governing elitist societies. This meant that Winston didn't have a conventional childhood upbringing. In 1876, his grandfather was appointed Viceroy of Ireland, with Randolph, Winston's father, becoming his private secretary, and this led to the Churchill family relocating to Dublin. This meant that most of his childhood years, from the age of approximately 2 years old, Winston and his brother Jack were cared for primarily by their nanny, Elizabeth Everest, who Winston affectionately nicknamed Womany. Later in adulthood, he wrote that his nanny had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived. Throughout much of the 1880s, his father Randolph and his mother Jenny were effectively estranged, and during this time, Jenny had many suitors. Winston had virtually no relationship with his father, in other words, love taken away, and referred to his mother, I loved her dearly, but at a distance, again, love taken away. At the age of 7 years old, he was shipped off to boarding school. He hated it, again, love taken away. Academically, he achieved very poorly and regularly misbehaved. Obviously, the cold, disciplined and unloving life of a boarding school, unattached from parental love, attention, affection, nurturing, safety and comfort that all children desperately need, in other words, too much love taken away, would have most definitely encouraged these most defiant, extreme ego emotions to develop as a means to seek the love, attention and affection that Winston was desperately lacking and so desperately needed throughout most of his early childhood years. This is why we can be 100% sure that these unattached emotions through lack of love, too much love taken away from both of his parents, will have most definitely developed many of his very early childhood extreme, unknown, involuntary, irrational, illogical, fear or hurt emotions to become dominantly stored into his long-term memory. There is even documental evidence through letters that Winston wrote to his mother while he was at boarding school, begging and pleading for his mother to come and see him, but she never did. However, along with Winston's very dominant set of extreme adult ego behavioural patterns, he was also blessed with some of his highly evolved emotional intelligence. We know this because in many of his letters, Winston showed a great deal of empathy and really cared about the people he met in his life, such as when he attended the funeral of his nanny, or when he sent a telegram from Africa to his mother when Winston's manservant died, so that his mother would inform the man's widow in person. And Winston's ongoing grief when many thousands of his soldiers were killed in battles, that showed a great deal of empathy, and that can only be found through some of mankind's more advanced, highly evolved emotions. Because this emotional combination gave him charisma and the extreme ego drive, strength and determination to make many intelligent emotional decisions as a dominant, popular and determined war leader. However, his main driving force that kept him going as a great war leader throughout all these very difficult war years was his own set of childhood extreme ego, fear or hurt emotions, because as a very young child he would spend many hours alone and isolated in his very large, cold and empty family home, Blenheim Palace, walking around the large rooms, studying all of the tapestries that were hanging on the palace walls. Many tapestries that were pictures of his ancestors that fought in many different past battles. And as we have already mentioned many times before, whatever we have stored into our long-term memories since early childhood is who we become. Winston knew every strategy that was taken in his ancestors' battles, and this gave him great insight into the strong will and determination, and of course the intelligent war strategies that he would need to lead us in the Second World War. Winston was even said to remark one day in childhood that he knew that his role as war leader was his destiny. I strongly believe that. We all have a destiny. In other words, our lives are mapped out for us before we are even born. But this is another story for another day. Because Winston's long-term memory had been firmly implanted as a very young child, with a combination of very early childhood, extreme, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that had been accumulating in his long-term memory unknowingly through too much love taken away, and this gave him the strong ego will and determination to lead us through the Second World War to victory. However, many times throughout this war period, his close friends, family members, and especially his wife Clementine, mentions that he would go into phases of deep depression. And this deep depression was his own set of childhood, extreme, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that would rise to the surface in his long-term memory and take over control in his long-term memory, and that he himself would call his black dog. These times of deep depression is when his long-term memory would begin to dwell on his early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that had been accumulating in his long-term memory unknowingly throughout his life since early childhood, through too much love taken away, and that became his own set of extreme adult ego behavioural patterns. And no one, not one single person, was able to release him from his extreme ego emotional suffering once he was functioning in his black dog. However, although Winston was a very courageous and popular war leader, he also made some very big mistakes before his time as war leader. This was again because he had developed a great deal of very early childhood extreme, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions that had developed to become in his young adulthood some extreme ego, arrogant and stubborn ego behavioural patterns, especially in his young adult years, such as his large support in trying to bring down the peaceful Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi, and when he became First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War, and he oversaw the Gallipoli campaign, but the campaign failed miserably, and many thousands of soldiers were unnecessarily lost in battle, and so he resigned and joined the Royal Scots Fusiliers on the Western Front for 6 months. But in order to get the full picture of Winston's extreme adult ego behavioural patterns, however, you will need to make your own research, because although his marriage to his devoted wife Clementine remained for 56 years, Clementine was sometimes known to find Winston's extreme ego-driven behavioural patterns that focus solely on the self, the I am, and on self-importance, sometimes somewhat unbearable. However, we mustn't forget how he developed these extreme adult ego behavioural patterns in the first place. We must never forget that throughout his very early childhood, he had experienced a great deal of lack of love, too much love taken away, that would have left Winston to develop these very unfortunate, extreme childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions, to become dominantly stored into his long-term memory. This is why you will find a link to a few documentaries of Winston's life in the index at the back of this book. We mustn't forget that the life of Winston Churchill is a small example of how all of mankind's childhood emotional events unknowingly influence the involuntary development of some very different, very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions to become stored into all of our long-term memories. And of course, there are nearly 8 billion plus people living in our modern world today, and therefore there are 8 billion different emotional reasons that we all become influenced throughout our very early childhood emotional events. But these emotional events began to develop our own individual set of very different childhood, illogical, irrational, involuntary, unknown, ego emotions to become stored into our long-term memories in all different degrees of strength, either through more love given or more love taken away. This is why love is the most powerful emotion of all of our human emotions, and this is the reason that it would be impossible to describe the childhood history of every single person alive today, and also all of our past ancestors' childhood histories. This is why these small examples of some of these historical figures that develop some of these very dominant or extreme ego, fear or hurt emotions gives us all a general idea of how important our different early childhood emotional events have over our lives and over all of our futures that most of us are unaware of.